In Episode 32, Model Constraints and Operational Architecture for Reality, we focus on designing systems that can survive real-world conditions rather than just looking good in whiteboard diagrams. Many architectures fail not because the ideas are bad, but because they quietly ignore latency, budget limits, staffing realities, or regulatory boundaries. When designs skip those constraints, the gaps show up later as fragile deployments, constant exceptions, and controls that only work on paper. Modeling constraints explicitly changes the conversation from ideal scenarios to viable ones. The goal here is to treat constraints as first-class design inputs so security and resilience hold up in production. A practical starting point is to document constraints in clear, concrete terms instead of leaving them implied. Latency expectations define how quickly users and systems need responses and how much jitter they can tolerate before behavior changes or timeouts cascade. Throughput constraints describe expected volumes, bursts, and concurrency levels that shape capacity planning and queue behavior. Budgets set limits on how much can be spent on platforms, tools, and people, which affects choices such as multi-region deployment, premium services, or specialized appliances. Skills and regulatory requirements add further boundaries by shaping what teams can operate safely and what the law demands in terms of controls, reporting, and data handling. Reflecting operational environments accurately means going beyond generic cloud labels and describing where and how systems actually run. Regions matter because they determine latency patterns, data residency boundaries, and even availability of certain services or features. Tenancy models influence isolation assumptions, whether you run in single-tenant setups, multi-tenant platforms, or shared infrastructure with other parts of the organization. Network egress rules and peering agreements affect which paths traffic can take, which security controls can be enforced at which layers, and how predictable costs remain as volumes shift. When architecture descriptions capture these environmental features, they become much more reliable guides for both design and risk evaluation. Real systems also have distinct runtime behaviors that must be modeled explicitly, including scaling limits, queue depths, and back pressure effects. Auto-scaling policies may define how quickly new capacity can appear, but there are always boundaries where growth flattens or becomes too slow to keep up with spikes. Queue depths determine how much work can be buffered before delays become user-visible or before downstream services are overwhelmed. Back pressure mechanisms, such as rejecting requests or slowing producers, change how upstream systems behave under load and must be part of the design, not an afterthought. When these runtime behaviors are captured, you can reason about how security and control mechanisms behave during stress, not just during calm periods. Failure modes deserve careful modeling because many security and reliability issues only appear when things go wrong. Timeouts can cause retries. Retries can multiply load, and multiplied load can turn a small glitch into a broader outage. Partial availability, where some services or regions function while others fail, introduces complex user experiences and potential data consistency issues. Degraded operations, such as read-only modes or reduced feature sets, may be acceptable for resilience, but must be pre-planned so controls and logging continue to work. Treating timeouts, retries, partial availability, and degradation as normal states that need design attention prevents surprises during real incidents. Data gravity and regulatory boundaries add another layer of constraint that cannot be ignored. Data gravity refers to the tendency of data to attract applications, analytics, and services around where it is stored, making certain patterns easier and others more difficult. Residency rules dictate where data must live geographically, while lawful processing restrictions define which jurisdictions and purposes are allowed. These factors shape where you can place services, how you design cross-region replication, and what encryption or anonymization strategies you must use. Modeling these aspects explicitly prevents architectures that depend on impossible or illegal data movements. Operational realities also include maintenance windows, patch cadences, and emergency change conditions that define when and how the system can be altered. Maintenance windows describe when components may be taken down or degraded, which affects how you schedule updates, migrations, and invasive security work. Patch cadences indicate how often operating systems, platforms, and applications can realistically be updated, shaping your exposure window to known vulnerabilities. Emergency change conditions describe when normal approvals may be bypassed and how you guard against uncontrolled risk during urgent fixes. Including these aspects in architectural thinking helps align control expectations with real operations. Human workflows are as much a part of operational architecture as any network path, so they must be modeled clearly. Support playbooks describe how frontline teams respond to alerts, user reports, and degraded functionality, including which tools they use and what evidence they collect. Escalation paths outline how issues move from first-line support to specialists, product teams, or security staff, including time expectations and communication channels. On-call coverage patterns define who is available, in which time zones, and for which systems, shaping how quickly issues can be addressed. When these workflows are captured, you can see whether your architecture relies on human behavior that does not actually exist. Observability tooling also has limits that should be treated as constraints, including retention windows and sampling strategies. Logging platforms may only retain detailed records for a certain number of days or weeks, affecting how far back investigations can reasonably look. Metrics may be aggregated, rolled up, or sampled, which is acceptable for trends, but may miss fine-grained anomalies or rare events. Traces might be collected for only a fraction of requests to keep overhead manageable. These choices affect how confidently you can detect and reconstruct events, so modeling them ensures your design does not assume perfect, infinite visibility. Assumptions about capacity, reliability, and resilience need explicit validation using load estimates, error budgets, and resilience targets. Load estimates should be grounded in historical data where possible and should include realistic growth scenarios and peak periods. Error budgets, commonly associated with service-level objectives, define how much failure or latency is acceptable before a service is considered out of bounds, which in turn informs priorities for improvement. Resilience targets describe how quickly systems must recover, how much data loss is tolerable, and what level of manual intervention is acceptable. Validating architecture against these numbers keeps designs anchored in hard constraints instead of optimistic guesses. Scenario walkthroughs and tabletop thought experiments provide powerful ways to stress test designs against these modeled constraints. In a walkthrough, participants follow a narrative of a failure or attack step by step, asking what each system, control, and human would do at that point. These exercises make explicit the paths taken by alerts, escalations, and decisions, and they often reveal mismatches between documented processes and actual behaviors. Tabletop sessions can explore multiple branches and what-if variants without requiring live disruption or complex simulation. By running these exercises regularly, you keep architectural models tied to lived reality and uncover hidden coupling before it causes incidents. Choosing patterns that tolerate variance is the natural outcome of modeling constraints honestly. Bulkheads separate components so that failure or overload in one does not immediately sink the rest, supporting compartmentalization of risk. Circuit breakers prevent repeated calls to failing dependencies, protecting both the caller and the callee from cascading collapse. Impotency ensures that retries, restarts, and duplicate messages do not corrupt state or cause unintended side effects when networks misbehave. These patterns allow systems to continue functioning, often in degraded but safe modes, while the environment around them fluctuates. In an operationally aware architecture, such patterns are expected, not optional extras. If you step back, the pattern for modeling constraints and operational architecture becomes clear. You capture constraints around latency, throughput, budgets, skills, and regulations. Describe the real environments where systems run, model runtime behaviors and failure modes, and represent data gravity and lawful processing boundaries. You layer in maintenance and change dynamics, human workflows, observability limits, and validated assumptions about load and resilience. Finally, you stress test designs and choose architectural patterns that can absorb variance instead of assuming steady, ideal conditions. This mindset creates systems that are less surprising, more explainable, and easier to defend. To make this real, consider updating just one architecture diagram today by adding the constraints that matter most to that system. Note the regions, latency expectations, patch cadence, support hours, data residency rules, and observability limits directly on the diagram or in its accompanying record. As you do, notice which design elements look less plausible once these boundaries are visible, and which controls may not behave as originally imagined. That single, constraint-aware update can become a template for future designs, helping you build architectures that are grounded in operational reality rather than wishful thinking. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.